I think one of the most important lectures I ever attended was when our teacher said to us, when you come across somebody who takes a different position than you, or somebody who wants to pick a fight with you, don't see it as an invitation to World War III. See it as a pastoral opportunity. And I am always so grateful for that particular lesson, because I found that you can disarm people, even the most aggressive people, by being pastoral in your response.
Welcome back to the Mending Divides podcast. I'm Jerry Swigart. Today, we're honored to be joined by Reverend Dr. Harold Good from Northern Ireland, pastor, author, and peacemaker who helped guide his nation through one of the most entrenched conflicts of the 20th century, the Troubles. Dr. Good's story is not just history. It's a living testimony of what it means to stand in the rubble of violence and dare to believe in the possibility of peace. As our own nation feels increasingly fractured by ideological and political divides, Harold's wisdom and experience offer a roadmap for how we, too, can become everyday peacemakers. Let's dive right into the conversation. Harold, I think that you have lived the story that seems to be unfolding in our own country, in the United States, and where it was sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. It's ideological violence in our own. However, it's becoming more and more seasoned with religious fervor. We're paying attention to this, and some of the commentary on Charlie Kirk's assassination, and is this person a martyr? And that's very religious language. That's not just political language. And then, of course, we're in a space of reciprocal assassinations. The right and the left are trading violence, lethal violence. And this is something that you've lived this story, and from within it, made some really significant decisions around how you're going to follow Jesus. And some of that had to do with your role as a pastor, Harold, but I think it has a lot more to do with you being a person of faith and recognizing that as the neighborhood burned around you, Jesus compels us toward the pain with the tools to heal rather than to win. And so I wanted to have this conversation with you because we need your guidance. We need your word. We need your story and your voice. And of course, I'm sitting next to the book that you wrote in which you actually tell so much of the story in good time. It's called, and friends who are listening in, I compel you to get In Good Time by Harold Good. It needs to be in the library of reconcilers on this planet. But it tells the story of much of your formation and how you showed up as a reconciler in the midst of the Troubles. But I wonder, for those of us who are listening in who are unfamiliar with the story that you lived, can you take us back to what was happening in the early days of the Troubles, especially as you began to pay attention to the acceleration of violence? What was happening around you, and how did that begin to invite you not to walk away from it, but to walk toward it as a peacemaker?
What was happening? I returned from a period of study in the United States in 1968, and my appointment was right into the midst of the inner city of Belfast, where things were just beginning to erupt. Northern Ireland was very influenced by what was happening on your continent at that time. The civil rights struggle in the US. I've said how just before I left America, I heard Joan Baez sing "We Shall Overcome."
Yeah.
And when I got back to Northern Ireland, there she was on a platform singing "We Shall Overcome." And the whole civil rights movement, the legitimate cry for the rights of a minority that time, and that was resisted by the established, traditional, unionist, loyalist Protestant, in inverted commas, community. And so you got this confrontation between two cultures, two aspirations, two creeds, all intertwined. Now we live in a world where what's happening in one place impacts almost overnight on another. And we're seeing that at the moment, aren't we?
Yeah.
The restlessness around the world. So I find myself almost as an innocent abroad in the midst of that. But I would have to say that my 4 years in the States had unconsciously, more than consciously, been preparing me for a ministry in a community that was not at ease with itself, where there was increasing fracture, and which, because of the resistance to the legitimate cry of people who were marginalized, that broke out then into, well, people feel that they are not being heard.
Yeah.
Violence is the language, sadly, to which they will so often resort. And that's what's happening here. And then counter violence. And so I found myself in the midst of this. And for me, as a pastor, in those situations, you have to stay somewhere in the middle of all of that, to stay detached from one or the other, so that if you want to have a ministry within a fractured society, you need to be very sure that you are, and I think this is where we learn from Jesus, who lived in a fractured and divided society, but did not get involved in taking this side or that side. He just took the side of what was right.
Yeah, I agree with that. And yet I see in the US right now, there's a lot of side taking happening between not just pastors, but congregants. There are different understandings of Jesus that are surfacing, and a Jesus who is in defense of my perspective, or a Jesus who justifies my behavior in pursuit of the world that I want. And so I see a lot of side taking, a lot of tribalism happening within the US American Christian community. Here you were in Northern Ireland, where you're Catholics and Protestants, that was more of the divide in that space. What did holding a more pro-human approach, what did not taking sides look like for you in that time?
Well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, because there comes a time when you have to, you're going to follow Jesus, you have to take his side very often, and put you in opposition to others, even others who claim his name. And that is always very difficult when you find yourself in conflict with people who claim that they also are following Jesus.
Right.
And where do you find the language? Where do you find the way of trying to break through that? Very often an impasse. And it's where I often say part of our problem is in our situation, people got confused between the kingdom of God and the United Kingdom. So you try to interpret your theology in political terms, and that has to be confronted. And that is clearly contradiction to the way of Christ. So in the midst of that, I think I would find myself in my preaching having to challenge some of what I knew to be a distortion of faith.
A distortion within your own congregation.
It would have been listening to other people and other strong voices. And I found apologetically that I had to challenge that kind of distortion, or not enough, in a way where I could open conversations with people. Not sort of saying, "Oh, this is the way," but challenging people in the context of a gospel interpretation and inviting them into a conversation. And a lot of what I would have done, some of it would be from the pulpit, but a lot of it would be on the streets. And people would confront you on the street.
Yeah.
And I found myself always like a street preacher.
Yeah.
I say, that's not what Jesus would say. And so, again, mostly through relationships. As I say, a lot of it was at firesides, kitchen tables, sometimes on the street when you'd meet people on the corner, and constantly trying to reaffirm that my role was not to take a political position. For example, the debate, are we going to find ourselves out of the United Kingdom and into United Ireland?
Mm-hmm.
And I would have to help people think through, is there a theological problem with this? And if so, what is it? Let's talk about that. And at the end of the day, you find yourself talking about territory rather than theology.
Ooh.
Culture more than creed. And having to help people to see the distinction between culture and creed and territory and theology.
Oh, that's so good. That is so good, Harold. I see that. I see that in spades here. Conversations that should be theological are territorial. And I think this moment in time is demonstrating for us how easy it is to be seduced into a kingdom of this world orientation rather than a kingdom of God orientation. It's so easy for these things to be confused.
Yeah.
So much of what you just said, I think, is dynamic. What I think is unique is that as a pastor in that time, as a Protestant minister, a Methodist minister in the Shankill, and for those of you who are listening, and that is in the epicenter of the Troubles, I think it would have been easy for you to understand your place as in the pulpit. Yet what you just said was, it happened in the pulpit, and in the pulpit, you're talking to your own people, right? Yeah. But it also happened in the streets and next to fires. Talk to us about that. I think that we need more pastors to use the pulpit well, but also make sure that what's happening in the pulpit is seasoned by what's happening in the streets and around fires. So talk to us about, how did you use these spaces? How did you find yourself there? Was it accidental? Was it intentional? What did you do around the fire? And how did that then inform your leadership of your congregation?
I'm going to say I think it's more accidental than intentional. I mean, your life is laid out for you. 11 o'clock on a Sunday and 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening. You have a responsibility to conduct worship and to preach. In those days, we would have had a morning service and an evening service. So the evening service would have been generally more people who were more faith-driven and would have been wanting to maybe probe more deeply. It'd be more like a study opportunity, and where you could really, like, Sunday morning tended to be all things to everybody, all families, all ages, and all of that. But I found that very often the Sunday evenings, when you had people who in a quieter and would be entirely an adult congregation in the evenings, I would treat it almost like a Bible study. Let's look more in depth at some of the things that are happening this week. Let's look and see, what is Jesus saying to us about this week? Not what I'm saying, not what I think, but what is he saying to us? And I find that prompted very, very, very important conversations. And sometimes those conversations would be followed up during the week. Maybe when you're visiting a home, I put a lot of importance on home visits in my ministry. It's the kind of thing that seems to have gone out of fashion here. But, in those days, you could knock on the door, people say, come on in, that cup of tea. And I found in those conversations where we didn't have an audience, so people could be honest with me and I could be honest with them. And sometimes it'd be, you were saying on Sunday morning something that I really had a problem with. Tell me, and off you go. Or sometimes I would be approached maybe by journalists, and they would want to do an interview with you on television or in the papers, and that would reach a wider audience. Maybe you'd be walking down the street and somebody say, "Hey, here, what did you mean by what you were saying the other day? That was ridiculous. Earth, And so comes off the conversation. So that's what I mean about conversations at firesides, on the street corner, within the context of worship, but totally being true, has to be true to your understanding of the gospel. You know, I would never have said, you know, if you're asking me, I think, I'll be saying, you know, let's look at what this means within a biblical context. And, you know, people find that very difficult to contradict if you can give a biblical basis for where you're coming from. Now, it doesn't mean I was preachy all the time, not at all. Because sometimes when you're with people who don't have any understanding of Scripture or who don't have any interest in it and who would actually be quite dismissive, you had to use a different vocabulary. But you could be interpreting the gospel in more secular language. And I think that is important as well.
Yeah, I think the idea of challenge in a way that opens up conversation is a critical life skill for all of us. We who are listening in, some of us are pastors, but the vast majority of us are not. And I think we're looking for skills, I think conversational peacemaking skills, to be able to find our way back into relationship with people with whom we disagree. One of the things that you just said, or even in the stories that you just told, are people would come to you and just say, I flat out disagree with you. Or what were you talking about? What did you mean when you said?
Yeah.
And it takes a kind of relational and conversational resilience. And what by that, I mean thick skin, soft heart, to be able to be challenged by another person's critique and actually stay in the conversation. It seems that like some of your challenge, the whole impulse behind it was to provoke conversation and often provoke it with people who might see it a little bit differently. How is that not intimidating to you? When someone came at you and said, I disagree with what you had to say, what was going on inside of you and how did you use that as a moment to actually build a relationship rather than fracture it further?
I think one of the most important lectures I ever attended was when I was in seminary. Our teacher in pastoral studies, he said to us, when you come across somebody who takes a different position than you, or somebody who wants to pick a fight with you, don't see it as an invitation to World War III. See it as a pastoral opportunity. See it as a pastoral opportunity. And I was so grateful for that particular lesson, because I found that you can disarm people, even the most aggressive people, by being pastoral in your response. I don't mean that you're sort of saying you're going to lie under it and say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. But letting them know that you're taking them seriously. You want them then to take you seriously. I take you seriously. It's an invitation asking you to take me seriously so that our conversation can be an honest one. And I'm going to respect where you're coming from and your right to say what you think. And all I'm asking in return is that you also hear me out.
Yeah.
You know, it can be a long, slow process because you might be only having those conversations with one or two or three people in a day or in a week. But I found that if I came at it in a pastoral way with people, understanding, I mean, you very often find that it's actually not you they're having issue with, but you're the fall guy. You're the person they can unload their anger. Very often, I would find when somebody took a very different position from me and was angry with me because of something I had said or a position that I took, very often you find this person was a hurting person.
Yeah.
There had been something in their family or in their situation. I think of somebody who had lost a very close loved one through violence. And here am I talking about forgiveness and grace. And they're saying, but you didn't lose anybody, did you? And I didn't. I had to sit and say, you know, you made me think I have to try and think my way into where you are at. And there's kinds of conversation which brought you into a relationship with people rather than confrontation.
Mm.
And where people would say, I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, and I can remember one night when I was, the police had asked me, they'd given me a megaphone.
Hmm.
And they said, because it was a very tense situation, it was all the potential of a hugely dangerous physical confrontation between people from our side of the road with people on the other side of the Falls Road. And they were at a barrier, and the police had made a cordon and tried to hold the crowd back. And they said to me, would you speak to these people? So I got up and gave me the megaphone, and I started to try to plead with the crowd. And there was one woman in the crowd who was very angry with me because of something I had said. And that she thought I was betraying the Protestant faith and all of that. And she started screaming, shouting at me about the fact that I had taken an initiative to build a relationship with the Catholic priest. And she shouted, there's a man who's, he's all chatting up the priests, you couldn't trust him. Don't listen to a word he's saying. And I could see a lynching, a verbal lynching, if not a physical one, coming on. There was a man who stepped out of the crowd. He'd been involved in some very violent, from the loyalist side. And he had told me about these, and he and I had sat at his fireside, literally, on more than one occasion. And I thought he had never heard me, but he stood up. He said, give me that megaphone. I had a megaphone.
Whoa.
And he stood up. And he appealed to the crowd, look, and he saved my skin that night. He was the most unlikely person that I could have thought of to come to my help in that situation. And he interpreted to the crowd what I'd been trying to say to him. And he'd been involved in some very violent things himself, and I had challenged him on these. But there he was. It's because he and I had built a relationship. It wasn't that he was agreeing with me, but he came to my defense to protect me, which in one part was he was saying, I actually don't agree with this guy, but I respect his integrity. And this isn't the way to deal with these situations. And the crowd dispersed at his request. I couldn't have dispersed them, but he did on my behalf.
Wow. Wow. No, that's incredible, Harold. What I'm finding in the first segment of this conversation so far is we're actually spending quite a lot of time talking about what peacemaking looked like within your own constituency, within your own crowd, and what it means to navigate disagreement and have conversational resilience. And like the fact that you had put in the time around the fire with this gentleman to the point at which he didn't see it like you saw it, but there was enough relationship where he was willing to risk his own safety to defend yours and to protect yours. That's the stuff. And then there's this whole other side that you just opened up where there was a widening fracture in your neighborhood, not just in your country, in your neighborhood, a sectarian fracture between Protestants and Catholics. And I wonder, what was it for you, Harold, where you began to recognize, yes, I need to do peacemaking work within my own community, but part of peacemaking and peace building also looks like me being in real relationships with people on the other side of the fracture. What was that realization like, and how did you go about building that relationship with that Catholic priest?
I think it was things had got so bad between the community that I was serving, and there was a very short physical distance between the Shankill Road and the Catholic Falls Road community. Very short physical distance.
And for those of us who haven't been there, we're talking hundreds of meters. Like,
yeah,
this is not miles.
No, it's over half a mile or so. People used to say it's a stone's throw, literally. But things were getting very bad. And So I remember thinking, we've no conversation or communication between the clergy on our side of the road and the clergy on the Falls Road, the Catholic side. No communication. It wasn't because we as clergy were antagonistic. We just didn't know each other.
Mm.
And so I remember I made contact with the priest at St. Peter's, Padraig Murphy, and you can't be more Irish than that. And he said, come on over. So I went over to his place and we got a good chat and we related very comfortably and very well. And found he had the same concerns as I had. So we decided I would bring some clergy from my side of the road and he would bring some from his side of the road. And we had a very good meeting. It was the first time there had been any kind of a crossover meeting. And at the end of the meeting, we said, you know what? We need to bring some of our lay people. So we decided next time we'd meet, we'd bring 3 from each of our congregations. And then somebody said, but where could we meet? Our lot won't come over to your place and your lot won't come over to our place. Where can we meet? And this is interesting, what's going on at the moment. I remembered getting a phone call from a member of the Jewish community who had said to me, we would like to do something to be helpful, but we don't know what to do because we're not seen as one or the other.
Yeah.
But he said, if there's anything we could ever do, you think, let me know. So I slipped out of the room and I phoned this gentleman and I said, we need a place to meet.
A neutral place.
Could we come to the synagogue?
Yeah.
He said, of course you can. So we had our next meeting when we brought people from our churches to the synagogue, where at that time they wouldn't have been ready to go to either one side or the other. And I think it's a supreme irony that it took the Jews to bring the Christians together. And they did. And we met there on more than one occasion. But that began, it broke down the wall of partition, if you like. So we were able to keep a relationship with each other. And I remember it wasn't long after that there was a terrible night when Catholic families were burned out of their homes in a place called Bombay Street. It was a terrible, terrible event. And the families were being sheltered and looked after in a Catholic school up in the other end of West Belfast. And I went up and brought the sadness of our people, because my congregation generally would have been very sad about this. And they were, saying, I said, is there anything you need? And they said, well, we need things for babies, and we need this, and we need that. And I went Sunday morning, the next day was Sunday, and I went up my pulpit and I said, I've been up to this place. But I took the liberty to go in your name, bring the sympathy of the Methodist people. And I asked her, is there anything they need? And they told me this, that, and the other. And I said, I'm going to go up again the next couple of days. If any of you had any of these things that you'd like to leave at the church, and I'll take them in your name. And I had the car full.
Is that right?
And I had some people going out of church, and they were a working class congregation. They weren't wealthy people. But they put money in my hand and said, well, we don't have any of those things you're looking for, but maybe that would help. And for me, it was incredible and very moving. And it was very moving both ways to go up into that Catholic school and bring these gifts and the thoughts and prayers. Now, that's not rocket science.
Yeah.
That doesn't take courage. That's just instinctively thinking. What would Jesus do in a situation like this? What would he have us do? You don't have to have a PhD in theology to understand that in obedience to what we claim to be and who we claim to be. And there were some of my friends that I thought, gosh, that was very courageous. And I find if you, again, in the context of the relationships that you build up with people and the trust, and they realize you don't have any ulterior motive in doing this. This is doing what is right.
Yeah.
And so I'm not putting this out as but I had the secret, because there were others doing the same thing.
Yeah. Yes.
And many of us were doing it together,
Right.
which was important, very important.
Right. And I think part of what I hear in that story, Harold, is, yeah, it may not have required courage. Courage probably looked like that time when you were standing with the bullhorn and people were getting worked
Yeah,
up. Or courage maybe looked like when you walked from your space into a Catholic space, knowing that's probably not the safest thing that you can do, but it's worth it for the sake of building relationship. But in the context of relationship, this wasn't courage to go up and express your grief and to bring supplies. You were just simply accessing compassion. That's just a deeply human thing to do, especially when we're in relationship with one another. And I wonder that moment right there that you speak of, I can only imagine that was contagious among your people. Because once you access and begin to unleash compassion, I think it becomes like a contagion and it starts to overtake people. What happened for your people, your congregation, in the aftermath of that act of compassion and generosity?
well, I think people just would have said, "Well, we're glad you did that in our name.
This is who we are.
Here we are. And it's the
Yeah.
thing we would like to do it. We didn't quite know how to do it, but you did it for us, or you helped us to. You were the channel, and
Yeah.
so that it's hard to know. I mean, all I'm saying is that if you instinctively thought, the problem with many of us here is we're always wondering what will other people think about what we're going to say, or what will other people think about what we're going to do. But people are saying, well, I wouldn't get away with that. Or if I said that, and there were some of the clergy in some of the churches here who found huge opposition to,
Yeah.
like, I think of one man who had to move.
Yeah. No doubt there were clergy who were punished by their people
Yeah,
for courage and compassion.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we come from a tradition which is perhaps a bit more open than others. I mean, some of the traditions here, I think, for example, of the people who, in parts of the Presbyterian world, where they are still the descendants of the settler people. And you know what that's about in your country, the conflict between indigenous people and settler people.
Yeah.
And where we have had people who are the descendants of the settler people, that can affect theology and understanding of how you relate to the people around you.
Harold, like the parallel that I would draw would be like the white militia movement, or even a little bit,
Yeah,
maybe a little bit closer to home, this phenomenon that some are referring to as Christian nationalism. This
yeah,
this understanding of the fusion between partisan politics and the Christian religion that is deeply tied to manifest destiny.
yeah.
And the settler orientation around a God who is for them, regardless of the cost of others.
I remember I sometimes tell the story how I used to go to St. Thomas's University in Houston.
Mm.
And I remember the first time Father Alec Reed and myself were invited to go out to this University of St. Thomas, where they had an Irish Study Centre. And we were staying in a lovely apartment on the campus, and we were having our breakfast on the first morning. And I was trying to think, what am I going to say now? And how am I going to explain something of our situation and our history and our context and blah, blah. So I was sitting there, and I happened to notice the milk carton. And I was fascinated by the brand on the milk carton, the Promised Land Dairy. That's fascinating, the Promised Land Dairy. And then I looked at it more closely, and there underneath, from Deuteronomy, this is the land God gave us. I took this into the class that I was speaking to, and I was saying, we have all the same challenge of trying to understand where we come from and where we find ourselves. And I said, that milk carton could just as easily be on a table where I come from.
Yep.
because there are people there, people where I come from, who believe this is a land that God gave us. And you think of South Africa, you think of other places around the world, people who believe that God has placed them in these places and given them this land, and that gives them license to live in a particular way and to whatever about anybody else in those geographical areas. And we have that within our culture, and it's a very strong element within our culture, and that influences people's political thinking, as well as their theological thinking. If you really believe this is the land God gave you, you may not even get much time to God, but if you think of this as the hand He gave you, that legitimizes your position. And that has to be challenged. That has to be challenged.
Yeah. And that's where, like, I want to go there next in this conversation, Harold, because I think we're in a space over here where folk are just writing those people off. Whether I'm conservative, I'm writing off those liberal people, or I'm a liberal person and I'm writing off those conservative people. And I think on both sides, there's malformed versions of Christianity that want to place God on our own sides. And
create God in our image.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And there is a societal atrophy of friend making or even just conversation across that fracture or across that divide. And one of the parts of your story that I admire so much is that you refused to distance yourself from people who hold a theology that claimed Jesus that was very different than yours, or had a desire for a future for the country that was maybe very different than yours. Rather than refusing to meet with these people and dehumanize them and other them from your side of the fracture, you utilized your table as an opportunity to bring people together, to form uncommon friendships with your ideological others. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the power of the table. How did you use the table and scones and tea? How did you use that to bring people together? And what did that begin to do in you? And what did you see it begin to do in others?
I remember we used to, some of us, I wasn't alone in these efforts. I remember saying, we need to begin to talk with people who think differently than we do. As Protestant clergy, we need to talk with people in the IRA, the Republican movement. And we found, interestingly enough, an open door. They were willing to come and meet with us. And we would meet around the table, meet with tea and scones, and began to disarm. And I remember at the same time, there were others who were very confrontational. They were going to bring people into the room, as we had tried to do, but they were going to bring people into the room to let them know what we thought of them and what they should do. And I remember going to one of these meetings, and I can remember fingers waving, if only you would do this, if only you. And I thought, I'm not going back to those meetings. That was where it started. That was where we then said, that's not the way. We'd come around the table, meet in that kind of atmosphere, rather than in the lecture theatre. And we began then to get some trust. In fact, we found after a little while, instead of us asking them to come and meet us, they would phone me and say, we'd like to talk over something with you folks. Would you be free tomorrow afternoon? And we said, of course. And so they would come, and they would take the initiative after we had taken the initiative. And those were very important conversations because there was a trust that had developed. They wouldn't have phoned us if they hadn't had reason to trust us. They weren't coming into this kind of confrontation. And then we came to the more difficult thing, but we've already established this trust. We've already got this conversation going. A much bigger challenge was for us to bring people from our own Protestant side of the community into conversation, people from the Republican nationalist side, because within the psyche of the people from within the Protestant loyalist community, to talk to your perceived enemy is to give credence to their position.
Yes.
To even suggest that you could have a conversation. So that was a huge challenge. I can remember, I tell the story for Jerry Adams, who was the leader of the Republican movement. I had been speaking in a Catholic church. I'd been making suggestions as to how we could become reconciled. And there was a question and answer session. There was a lady said, Reverend Good, you won't remember me, but I remember you. I said, oh, really? Yeah, she said. When we were put out of our house by the Protestants, you took us into your church and looked after us until we were rehoused. She said, for 40 years, I have carried bitterness in my heart for what happened to us when we lost our home. But she said, tonight, I'm going to let it go. I'm going to let it go. Then there was a young man who came to me a few minutes later, whose wife had been killed in an IRA bomb. And he said to me, Jerry Adams was at the back of the church. I have to make my peace with Jerry Adams. And he said, should I go and speak to him? And I said, not here. There are people around with cameras, and there would be a journalist, and he would grab you, and that wouldn't be. I said, if you're up to it, he's up for it. Why not come to my table? I'll pour the tea. You guys can do the talking.
Wow.
And they became reconciled to each other.
Yeah.
And who had lost his beautiful wife to an IRA bomber whose coffin was carried by Jerry Adams.
Wow.
Carried the coffin of the man who had killed his wife. And he sat. And now I can only give credit to the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah.
I take no credit for that.
Yeah.
All I can credit for is pouring tea.
Yeah, Harold, that's what strikes me about some of your superpower as a peace builder, in my view, is such.
Yeah, because after long time building a trust in both of the relationship with both those people. To say then, I pour the tea.
You pour the tea.
But the Spirit takes over.
And that's like, as people of faith, I think the greatest, most liberating news is that there is no force more committed to repair than the Spirit of the resurrected Christ.
Yeah.
And we get to be a part of it, right? And in your case, it's you knew the significance of a table outside of the view of cameras. You knew the power of hot tea and your wife's delicious peace scones to set the conditions for reconciliation to happen. The other thing that I want to just draw out, though, is the amount of time that it takes to build the kind of trust where Jerry Adams, who was a very significant political leader, would accept that invitation to come to your table. And I think we live in this moment where we offer an attempt or two at kindness or at relationship, and maybe it's rejected, or maybe it doesn't go as far as we want it to, and then we bail, like we give up, we stop. When in fact, the pace of growing trust, which is critical to the work of reconciliation, is far slower than any of us are comfortable with. Help us understand how you went about building trust. Like, what's your, not like in a prescriptive way, although it sounds like that in my question, but how did you do it? How did you become efficient or effective at building trust?
So there are some people who would say it's about naivety.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I honestly wouldn't die in a ditch for either causes of these folks. I don't
Hmm.
say I'm a very content citizen of the United Kingdom, but I wouldn't die in a ditch to preserve the Union against all other odds. I'm a very contented Irish man as well. That's my DNA also. So, you know, some people say, well, you don't stand for anything, do you?
Hmm.
Because I don't, this isn't for my emphasis, it's not for my loyalties or in either of these political camps. And so people maybe say you're a bit of an innocent abroad, aren't you? You're naive. You wander in and out of these places. I had an aunt who used to get very impatient with me, and she said, "You're neither one thing nor the other." And I'd say, "Well, I think that's not a bad place for a pastor to be." And that story about Jerry Adams and a young man who lost his wife. 2 days after that, I came home, and there was a little tree on my doorstep,
Hmm.
the card attached. It was a thank you from Jerry Adams,
Hmm.
thanking me for having facilitated these things. Now, Jerry Adams' hobby is planting trees.
Ah.
He has a big glass house where he cultivates plants, and he had picked out this little tree is out there in my garden.
Hmm.
Call it my peace tree.
Yeah.
My peace tree.
Wow. Wow.
Because that was his way of saying thank you, because
Hmm.
it meant it was important to him that he was able to engage with this man who was a victim of partly of his making.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what I was saying is people would say, gosh, you're naive, aren't you? Yeah, well, I'm happy to be naive if that's how people see it.
Yeah.
And it's intentional on my part. It's not that that I sort of drift into these situations. It's very intentional
Mm-hmm.
because I can't be easily identified as this or that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get
Yeah.
forgiven for that because they think I'm naive.
Yeah.
And I don't try to dissuade them.
Yeah. Yeah. Your naivete greased the skids for a lot of repair to happen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
let me just ask you one last question. In this conversation, you're speaking to a community of people who recognize that we are seeking to follow Jesus in the midst of a country that's addicted to conflict, that's consumed by violence. And it seems as though we're careening toward a sheer cliff right now as a society. I have lots of conversations with followers of Jesus who want to be a part of repair. They want to do the work of peace building, but hope is wilting toward despair. And I wonder what would you say, and especially for you, I guess, as you were living this story and moments for you when you felt fatigued or overwhelmed or when hope was wilting, what did you do? What would you say to a community of people who are living now a reality that you're familiar with in this regard?
I'll answer your question more specifically within the context of explaining how way back in the early 70s, I was invited to a World Council of Churches event in Bangkok.
Mm-hmm.
I was only a young fellow at that time, and I loved to travel. So I accepted the invitation to go to Bangkok. The World Council of Churches, it's a big body of people, and they had this very important event in Bangkok. And they invited myself and a young woman, a Roman Catholic young woman. They invited us to come and explain to this body something of what was happening in Belfast at that time
Mm.
from her perspective. So young Catholic in the Legion of Mary, and my perspective as a young Protestant minister. That was very interesting, very challenging. But I can remember the first night we were there, we were in small groups, and there was a little black priest in the group. We were all telling each other who we were. He was very recognizable. in later years, but not in that particular night. Desmond Tutu, he just were sitting there in the group and we were saying, I'm Harold, and he was saying, I'm Desmond. And we weren't to know in the years that went by. But there were two things that happened at that conference, two things I brought home from me at that conference that were hugely important for me. One was an address that was given by a politician from Angola who had been a freedom fighter, a terrorist in the struggle in Angola, but who is now a minister in the government. And that, I said to myself, here's he was being a terrorist and he's now minister in the government. And he was trying to help us see something of the journey that he had made. And when I came back, I was interviewed by journalists here about the experience, and there was a big headline in the local papers. Methodist minister says we've got to bring the terrorists to the table. And that's really where that probably began for me. I was so affected by this man. And I came back and without thinking, I said to this journalist, I was like, we've got to bring people to our table. We can't leave them out. And that was way back in 1973, I think it was, way back then. And I never thought for a moment that I'd be bringing them to my table before they went to another table. But anyway, that's the first thing. Then there was the closing address was given by a theologian, Jürgen Moltmann. May know that name. And I remember his final sentence. He spoke, and I can't remember anything else he said, but I do remember his last. He looked at us, he said, whatever else, never ever forget that Jesus can take the inevitability out of history. And those two were worth that whole journey to Bangkok, bringing people to the table and never ever forget that Jesus could take the inevitability out of history. And I've hung on to that when everybody is saying there's no change, nothing happened, nothing will ever be different. So I can take no credit for a lot of what I've done because I was hugely influenced by those two speakers at that conference. And I had no idea that journey was going to be so important in my own journey. On the one hand, facing the reality of these people who were doing dreadful things to each other and to our world and to our country, but not writing them off, saying nothing will ever change, is all hopeless, saying Jesus can take, if we allow, can take the inevitability out of our history. I'd say those two things have been very much a part of my life, the influence upon my ministry. And talking about America, I mean, I agree deeply because we had 4 very special years in the United States, learned a great deal, learned a lot in the classroom. I owe a great deal to those who helped us in that journey in our own thinking as young pastors. But I also built up some very wonderful friendships. We still have frequent conversations with our friends in America. And we grieve for what's happening in your country. We really do grieve, at the way it's taking.
Yeah. Well, if you come to the U.S., my friend, there are hundreds of us that would gladly sit in a room and learn more. Your life is marked by the courageous, costly, creative love of Jesus, Harold. And thanks be to God that those seeds that dropped in Bangkok one day shaped your life and your love and your leadership. And I want you to know that as you've told me those stories, those seeds have dropped in my life as well. And I know for we who are listening in, those seeds have now dropped, hopefully into the fertile soils of our souls. And God, that you would germinate them, bring them to life for the sake of repair in this place. And so thank you, Harold, for the gift of your time.
That's true. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, my friend. I hope you found as much encouragement in Harold Good's words as I did. See, his story reminds us that even in the midst of deep division, trust can be built, relationships can be restored, and peace is always possible. If reconciliation was possible in Northern Ireland, it's certainly possible here as well. Thanks for listening to the Mending Divides podcast. If this conversation stirred something in you, share it with a friend, and keep leaning into the work of peacemaking right where you are. Until next time, may we become people who mend divides and embody peace in a dividing world.
Make us instruments of peace where there's hatred.